I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical for a community.
before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Literary expert and Penn State professor Linda Patterson Miller has dedicated her career to uncovering the fascinating real-life stories behind some of America's most well-known authors, including Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Her book, Letters from the Lost Generation, re-examines the personal and literary relationships of these great writers. We'll talk with her about what their letters reveal, how real life is often more interesting than fiction, and about why the works of the lost generation are still relevant today. Here's our conversation with Linda Patterson Miller. Linda Patterson Miller, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
You have written extensively about the group of literary and artistic figures Gertrude Stein dubbed the Lost Generation. Why so fascinated by this group, which included F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, and so many others?
I think everybody's fascinated with that era of the lost generation. We think of it usually in the 1920s, time post-World War I, when there was great disenchantment about the old truths and the old institutional values, and questioning post-World War I about what really matters most and what do we believe in. And that genuine questioning led to some of the most extraordinary art of our day, and of any day, really, a kind of renaissance, which we call modernism. So many of these American artists left America after World War I and went over to France, gathered in Paris at the cafes, and were part of this confluence of the arts that was an interchange of all artists. It was very unique. Music, dance, painting, writing. The artists were picking up on the creative activity that they said was in the air. And that led to some of the most extraordinary art for American literature, particularly the art of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway were the key figures of that time period. And I think that people are drawn to the uniqueness of this art.
You mentioned F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway as being the key people, and of course they're the best known of the lost generation. But I think arguably at the center of this group of artists were a couple that you write about in your book, Letters from the Lost Generation, a much lesser known couple by the name of Gerald and Sarah Murphy. Explain who they were.
Well, they were an American couple who lived in New York City until they left for France in 1921. Gerald Murphy worked for his father's business, the Mark Cross Company in New York City. And
very wealthy couple.
Very wealthy couple. Her family had money from the Weiberg family, the Cincinnati ink magnates. And they together realized that they didn't want to be a part of this, what Gerald Murphy called the crass business world, and that they wanted to go over to Europe. Initially, Gerald Murphy was going to be a landscape gardener, a landscape artist. And he got to Paris and was walking the streets of Paris and saw this new art for the first time.
Modern art.
Modern art in the galleries everywhere. Americans hadn't seen much of this art before. And he felt what he called a shock of recognition, and said, if that's painting, that's what I want to do. And he became overnight a painter who gained recognition in Paris. Picasso said he was the only American working in the modern manner. So Gerald and Sarah Murphy went to France. They were kind of leaders, pathfinders.
They were magnets for all of these
magnets for these artists who came and discovered them. There are amazing interconnections between this whole group of artists that ended up gathering on the French Riviera at Gerald and Sarah Murphy's Villa America. Ironic that they named it Villa America. And so they did become increasingly the center of this whole artistic movement, and their lives get worked into the art of the day.
They get worked into F. Scott Fitzgerald's greatest book, The Great Gatsby, for example. And a lot of the inner workings of the relationships is revealed in letters. You work primarily with what you call primary documents, letters. What can we learn from letters, for example, that we couldn't learn if we read a biography or even an autobiography of F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway?
Well, I think you get the untempered voice, the fresh voice of the person writing that letter. No one is shaping it for you. I myself discovered the Murphys just by chance by going into Princeton University Library and looking at a folder of letters from the Murphys to F. Scott Fitzgerald. I had no idea who the Murphys were. And I was so captivated when I first was reading this letter from Sarah to Scott. I didn't even know who Sarah was. And she's saying to him, you don't know anything about anybody, least of all yourself. You have a lot of loose stones rocking the basement. But consider me your good friend, love, Sarah. And I'm thinking, wow, who is this woman, Sarah, who can tell F. Scott Fitzgerald that he's crazy and doesn't know anybody? And I began to just research and gather more and more letters between Sarah and her husband Gerald and Fitzgerald, and then learned that it was a whole network of people who were interconnected kind of through the Murphys. And so the more of these letters that I gathered with all these fresh, untempered voices of the letter writers themselves, and began to put them together into a group narrative, really, what emerges is that these people are able to tell their own stories. Here you've got characters who have been so mythologized over time. The Fitzgeralds, diving into the fountains in New York City and breaking Sarah's cocktail glasses. All these stories that emerge about these larger-than-life characters. But when you put together and let them tell their own stories through these primary documents, what emerges is a really truer account.
You said that it shatters the myths, the stereotypes that we have about them. One of the letters that, an ending from one of the letters that I found interesting for a number of reasons, because we think of Ernest Hemingway as spare and unsentimental in so many ways. He ends a letter to Sarah with very much love, and love also with love, Ernest.
Yes. I mean, his letters with Sarah are beautiful, tender. He seemed to turn to Sarah over and over again during points of despair and tension in his own life. And the same thing was true for her also. I think there was a very strong intimacy. I don't think it was a sexual relationship, but a true intimacy. Sarah and Gerald suffered some real tragedies in their lives with the deaths of both sons at the age of 16. And that fed into the relationships with their friends, because everyone gathered around them. But it also fed into the literature and became a kind of metaphor for the day, that life as you would like to be is not life as it is. And so that kind of creative tension emerges. And Sarah Murphy and Hemingway really spoke very frankly to each other. And that comes through very much in their letters over and over again. The
interesting thing about what you just said about women being taking up and kind of feeling a responsibility to reveal the real Hemingway and the real Fitzgerald is that at one point, women, you said, wouldn't be upfront about their interest in or reading Hemingway. You said your mother-in-law actually looked you in the eye and said, Ernest Hemingway, he's a dirty old man and a slob.
Yeah. And she liked to repeat that many times for me. And I think there is, among women, still that perception a bit. But the difficulty is that people have a perception of the stereotype, but I don't know that they actually have read the art. And so the mission is to get people, through the humanities and our on that mission field for the humanities to actually read and confront the art. And when you do, I think it allows us to get past those perceptions. I don't know how much of Hemingway my mother-in-law actually read, but she didn't understand how I could write about this dirty old man.
How has your immersion in these primary documents, these thousands and thousands of letters, how has it informed your teaching? My guess is as you've read these, your teaching has to have evolved over the years.
Absolutely. It's such fun to teach what I teach. Right now I'm doing a course on the literature of the lost generation. And I do work into the course a lot of the research that I do, and actually involve students in my research too. Some have been able to do presentations at conferences, one just this past summer. But it's fun to bring into class some of these primary documents and have students actually see them, to show them how those primary materials really influence the art and help us understand the art in better ways. For example, some letters from Hemingway. He got a Dear John letter from Agnes von Kurowski, the nurse in Milan, where he was recuperating after his World War I injuries. And she sends him this horrible Dear John letter, which we actually have that letter. And what's emerged in these new letters of Hemingway's now, we've discovered a letter that Hemingway wrote to his friend Bill Horn on the very day that he got
the Dear
Agnes's
John
letter. And so it adds just another layer to that, and we can hear Hemingway saying to Bill Horn, she doesn't love me, Bill. It was just a mistake, one of those little mistakes, you know. And he said, I tried to be light about it, but I'm just smashed by it. So these people become really alive through these letters, and it is fun.
You mentioned the death of Gerald and Sarah's two sons, one from tuberculosis, another from meningitis, as young boys, young men. And F. Scott Fitzgerald says he can't possibly come up with the words to be able to convey how tough this was.
Yeah, here are these great artists who create inventive works of art are recognizing that you can't invent real life. Gerald Murphy wrote to Fitzgerald and said, life itself has stepped in now and scarred, blundered, and destroyed. He said, only the invented life is beautiful.
What's interesting about all of these people is that there was tremendous tragedy in all of their lives, which leads me back to what I think is probably a myth, that in order to be a great artist, you have to have suffered. Do you believe that?
That seems to play in and out of the art, doesn't it? And you look at these artists like Fitzgerald and Hemingway, where there is, I think, an underlying darkness in the literature, and the reader of Hemingway's art, for example, feels that more than understands that. Hemingway recognized, his father committed suicide when Hemingway was 29 years old, and Hemingway, of course, killed himself.
7 members of the Hemingway family took their lives.
Hemingway grappled his whole life with that recognition of life's complications. And these artists at one point gathered on the terrace of Villa America discussed this idea of tragedy, recognizing how it plays into art and how their lives draw upon it. And they came to the conclusion that tragedy, they said, is not death, but tragedy is life and its terrible complications and our helplessness in the face of ourselves. And that's what you see coming through in the art. I think that the artist who is willing to confront those complications, and that's what feeds the art. And so it's very powerful for us as readers of these literary texts or viewers of the paintings, that I think we do feel that underlying tragedy. And I don't know that you could say that the artists themselves suffer more or encounter more difficulties, but maybe they're more in tune to the nuances of suffering, the emotional atmosphere of suffering, and that's what they get in their art. And why it's powerful for us, because it forces us to confront our own sorrows and complications in our lives.
When Ernest Hemingway won the Nobel Prize, he didn't go to Stockholm, but he wrote and recorded a message to Stockholm. And in it he said that he didn't think he was going to live more than 5 years, that he had a lot of work to do. And another time he said, and I found this interesting, he would rather have a good life than be a great writer.
Well, he did say that. He said a lot of things, but I think in the long run, what makes his art so powerful and what makes the art of Fitzgerald, for example, so powerful is that these artists lived for their art with a capital A, and that was part of that era, back to what you were asking originally, what's the power of this lost generation? That they were willing to confront the big life questions.
Make the invisible visible.
Make the invisible visible, get at the emotional truth of what it means to be human. And they were trying to cut through all the cant and the propaganda and the euphemisms that people feel comfortable living with because it's a protective cover. And so they're really challenging all that. But they did say, and Hemingway said, that if he could not write, he no longer wanted to live. And I think that is really ultimately why he killed himself, because he lost his memory, really, which is the artist's reservoir of truth and beauty, and he really couldn't write anymore.
fact, he died, and F. Scott Fitzgerald died, as Garrison Keillor put it, in the saddle with their boots on. They were both in the middle of writing important works.
True.
In the case of Hemingway, he was writing his memoir, The Movable Feast, and Fitzgerald was reading The Last Tycoon about Hollywood. And they were finished by other people, both of those works. And I'm wondering if you think that those who finished those works, filled in the blanks, did them justice.
Well, I would disagree with that a little bit about Hemingway's A Movable Feast. He actually, and it's controversial, and recently a restored edition of The Movable Feast came out where things that had been cut were
restored with quotation
added
marks
onto the end, and there's some controversy as to how much of a role Mary Hemingway, Hemingway's final wife, had in arranging the text. I think that A Movable Feast is one of Hemingway's most extraordinary manuscripts, and I believe that he really had finished that manuscript prior to his death. He was afraid to publish it because of the libel issues.
He was critical of F. Scott.
I mean, he's dealing with real people, and so he held back a little bit on it. But I think the manuscript was very much shaped and very much intact. He himself had cut some things, for example, about the Murphys. He was pretty cruel to the Murphys, who had been so instrumental in his life, accusing them of being the understanding rich who leave everything dead behind them. That's a pretty brutal thing to say when you're dealing with people who have lost their two sons. But he was really kind of dealing with himself, too, in his own sense of betrayal, the way he had betrayed Hadley and the other betrayals of his own art.
Hadley, of course, was his first wife, and Gerald Murphy actually said to him in a letter, which he said, "This will only be seen by the two of us, or by our eyes." He basically told Hemingway, "Drop her, she's not good for you." And he blamed him for that.
To what you were asking about the primary documents here, when I discovered that letter that Gerald Murphy had written Hemingway in 1926, at a point when Hadley and Ernest were separating, but Hemingway was having second thoughts about it, and Gerald Murphy visited him in Paris, and they talked quite intimately, if you believe Gerald's letter to Hemingway, about the breakup. And then Gerald wrote him this extraordinary letter that tells him point blank, cut clean and sharp. And he sets up a classification system, too, of wives and husbands, and wives are not necessarily artists. There's a big question mark there.
For what Hadley was,
their mothers,
what she contributed.
And I think that Hemingway followed Gerald's prompting at that point of his own vulnerability. He never forgave Gerald Murphy, and he never forgave himself.
In fact, he talks lovingly, he writes lovingly about Hadley. Some say it's in honor, that A Movable Feast is in honor of Hadley, because he writes so lovingly about her in virtually every chapter, and very viciously about his second wife, Pauline.
Well, he groups Pauline in there with the predatory rich, the understanding rich, who come in and destroy the innocents, and who do leave everything dead behind them. So none of these people are named. Pauline's not named, and Gerald and Sarah aren't named, but it's very clear in the context of the work who he's talking about.
Do you think these relationships ultimately served all of these artists well?
Oh, I think they served each other marvelously. I don't think we would have had the same art that we have today if it weren't for these relationships. They were mutually remunerative relationships. They were intimate relationships. They, in the larger sense, I don't think they did betray each other at the very basic levels. Some can criticize Hemingway for the way he treated Fitzgerald in A Movable Feast, but I find it actually a very tender portrait that underscores the way that Hemingway and Scott really were very close to each other and very open with each other, that Scott comes to Hemingway and asks him about his own sexuality because Zelda has accused him of not being able to satisfy her. And some say, well, Hemingway's manipulating this, making himself look more masculine because he's the leader in masculinity with poor Scott. But a very tender portrait of Scott that comes out of there. So I think overall the relationships, I don't think they ever regretted the relationships. To the very end, they said they loved each other. Even Fitzgerald, when Hemingway works Fitzgerald into the story Snows of Kilimanjaro and talks about,
not very flatteringly,
poor F. Scott Fitzgerald, he loved the rich too much and it destroyed him. And when Scott read that story with his name in there, he was devastated and wrote their mutual publisher, Max Perkins, to say, could you please tell Ernest to lay off of me in print? But he said, no, he added, no matter what he says, what Ernest says, I still have a strong pull toward that man and love him.
You mentioned how beautiful F. Scott Fitzgerald could be, and that made me think of Robert Redford playing him, playing Jay in Gatsby. And then, of course, Midnight in Paris, you see all of these characters played by different people. And I think of all of the movies that have been made, is there one where you think they got it right? That really is what Hemingway was like, or what F. Scott Fitzgerald was like?
Well, ironically, I think that Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris gets it better than anybody else. When any of the producers, directors have tried to render into film these great works of art like The Great Gatsby or The Sun Also Rises, it can't be done. You have, first of all, in The Great Gatsby, it's such an interior novel. It's all told through the voice of Nick Carraway. It's really not about Gatsby, it's about Nick Carraway. And it's very hard to render that interior space in film. So what you get is just plot, all these frantic actions, the parties, the dances, and it misses the whole creative tension of the work of art. So I have not seen any film that I feel has really, so I'm anxious to see this new one coming out, but we'll see what they're able to do with that. But Woody Allen captured the magic of Paris, and he, through kind of parody and stereotyping, was able to capture those characters, and it was pretty real, I think.
I'm curious to know if you think that F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway would be satisfied with their legacy, and I ask that realizing that when F. Scott Fitzgerald died of a heart attack at 44, not that many people attended his funeral, just as not many people attended Jay Gatsby's funeral in The Great Gatsby. And Ernest Hemingway, although he won the Nobel Prize, he's not always on the top 10 author list as F. Scott Fitzgerald seems more inclined to be. Do you think they'd be satisfied?
I think they would. First of all, I think with Hemingway, he's one of the joys of being able to talk about Hemingway is that I think there is this perception that Hemingway is not an artist for our times because he was too masculine. There's this stereotype of the macho image of Hemingway. And his art is actually very tender and gets at those underlying emotional truths that we feel more than understand. And so people now, I think, with a lot of female scholars, such as myself, Sandy Spanier, who's the editor of the Hemingway letters that we're publishing at Penn State, a lot of female scholars who are out there and saying, no, let's cut past these stereotypical perceptions and really see the art of this man. And so I think Hemingway would be very pleased, and I suppose particularly to see that women are in the vanguard of resurrecting his art. There's a continuing pull for Hemingway's art, and also Fitzgerald's. The renaissance of Fitzgerald's art has been extraordinary, and it's continuing.
Linda Patterson Miller, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Linda Patterson Miller. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find more information about the writers of the Lost Generation. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.